Over the last 2 weeks, I did an advertisement on one of the websites about blacksmithing and equipment that I have for sale. And some of the equipment I'm going to keep and set up a forge. And in 2 to 3 weeks, I'll have that built and ready to go. And we'll actually start showing people how to do blacksmithing work from the beginning. The most important thing to me when you do any kind of metal work is that you set everything up safely and you know the procedures to follow. Like in the first episode, I tried to show what was necessary for safety with gloves and aprons. And if you look online, a lot of the men and women that are doing this are just wearing t-shirts and jeans, and they're not even wearing boots. And this is something that if you just make one mistake, you're talking 2,000 degrees of metal dropping on you, getting your clothes on fire. So I try to tell people in the beginning, even because it's new to you, and it doesn't mean that later you should not protect yourself, but in the beginning you should be overly cautious about the clothing you wear, the area you work in, and you want to make sure you have a fire extinguisher, water, sand, there's all kinds. And I keep burn packs. It's a little package that you tear open if you have a burn, and you put it on the burn. And then you should always have someone around while you're working if possible. And if you ever really get hurt, you want to be sure that your medical information is available. And it's not much fun to talk about this stuff, but it can happen, and a little bit of prevention will go a long way. This is a 1910 forge. I have several of these. These come in, and typically they only stay here for a week because they're so hard to find. This particular one has no brand name. A lot of them were made by different companies, and I don't know why they didn't put their name on it, but there's no name. I like this one. I may even keep this one because I am left-handed. Now most people are right-handed, so they would take their left hand, place it on the blower, and by cranking slowly, you can control the heat. And the heat is the whole thing. Anybody you listen to is going to tell you that it's the heat and the fire and how long you leave it in it, and the ventilation of that gives you the temperature you want. And that's the trick to this whole thing, is getting the temperature right, getting the steel or iron at the right point, and then working it, and then obviously putting it back in the fire. So in the beginning, when we get the shelter built up for the blacksmithing, you'll see that you put a material here to start the fire, you cover it, but when you're working, you're going to crank this up to get your temperature higher. There'll be a pile of coal here, and the flame will get it at least that high. Now some people put an exhaust this way, heat rises, some people like the exhaust over top. Whatever works best for you in the area you're in. But this particular one, it's round, most of them are square, like the other one I'll show you in a minute. So I really like this one. I can hammer with either hand, I can work with either hand, and these usually sell for around $550 up to around $800, depending on the condition, the brand. Most of them have cracks in them. It's not unusual, and it's not something that you should be concerned about. And then over here, this is a Chicago. This is a brand name. There were several brand names of forges that were very popular. They were made in the thousands because early in the century, the blacksmith repaired everything. He did horseshoes, he did carriages, wheels, any kind of farm implement that they used then that was metal, most people could not fix. So they took it to the blacksmith to either repair or make a newer unit for them. Grain units, all the metal farm stuff that we used in the turn of the centuries. And that's where all these came from. These are smaller ones. Most smiths had trays that were 6 by 8 feet. They built them in stone or brick or some material, and then made the trays themselves. You can line them with Back then they used clay material. You can use asbestos, which was used in the 50s and 60s, is now outlawed, but it actually was a very efficient material. And now they have fire brick, so it's a lot easier to set up a larger forge if you're going to be doing big work. Most people are just doing small work. It's, you know, they want to make knives or tools or any kind of fireplace hardware, anything. So a smaller forge for the most part is very practical. There are reproductions, there are newer versions of the tray forge, and they range in price from a couple $100 up. Most of them are made in China. Nothing wrong with that. It's just a question of what you want and what you like to work with. Most people desire these older units, and that's just personal preference. So this is a Chicago. This one has a crank. So when you get your fire going, you're controlling it with the crank. And the blower goes down through the bottom and comes up into the center of the fire. And that's what makes the fire get hotter quicker. When you are tapering off, you let the fire die down. And if you're stopping, you give it a while to actually go completely out. Again, this one has a crack in it as well. Like I said, it's not unusual. Someone made these parts, some sheet metal worker made these parts. And what that does is it reduces the size of the tray. And this is not original, but it was an interesting a way of doing it. You can see the lip on this one's dropped, and that's the side typically you would work from, would be in the front. You'd lay your iron or your tools in there, whatever you're trying to heat up. So this is a Chicago. It's a pretty small tray, but again, I think for most people's work, this one would work. And then we go into, this is a relatively small 100-pound anvil. When you're buying an anvil, it really depends on the kind of work you're going to do. The horn and this flat area are what you have to look at. This should be in pretty decent shape. A lot of the ones you find will have breaks on the edges where the pieces are actually broke off. And it depends on the quality of work you're going to try to do. For the average person doing this stuff at home as a hobby, most of the anvils you're going to find are going to be used and somewhat beat up on these edges because they've been used for so long. It doesn't mean it's not usable. It just means it's older and it's been used. As long as this is good, you got your horn, the sides are good, there's no cracking in it. That's one thing you have to be careful of when you buy these. If there's no cracking, that's a good sign. On the top, you have your hardy hole and pritchel, and these hold the tools that you would work with to split metal. And these are, you can get these new. I mean, you can buy them antique, but you can also get them new. This doesn't fit this particular one, but again, it's a parting tool. So you're going to have all kinds of attachments that you can get to do different styles of work. And that leads to hammers. There are at least 100 that I know of, different style hammers. And the hammers are used for different, this could be used for cutting, separating, marking. Now this has a dimple on the front, which means it might have been used for something else, for making a surface like a ball peen kind of look. It would have dimples in it. Even though this traditional, what I used to call a monkey wrench, has gone out of vogue because there's so many tools now from China. This is no longer needed for most plumbing. This was originally used for a lot of plumbing in work, but actually it was used for blacksmith work. And this would, you could close this down on your metal. If you had a tool that was sitting up here and you wanted to bend a piece of metal with it, you would take this as a partial wood handle that keeps it cool, and you would take that and twist it. Like if you want to make a twisted section, this is the tool you would use. and you would actually pull it around, and that's what it was used for. But these are actually getting harder to find, and a lot of times it's the same problem. The jaws are all beat up, or the thread is no good. This is a really nice one. A lot of them don't have the wood. They just have a handle on them. Some are metal, some are the later ones are plastic. But this is actually pretty. This has not been cleaned. None of these things have been cleaned yet. They just came in the shop. So these are all tools that I'm gonna have available. This is kind of a large ball peen. Usually you don't use a hammer this big. They're usually 3 to 4 pounds. But again, it depends on the work you're doing and the end result. This you'd have for larger work and thicker work. And it really comes down to having a series of pieces. Each hammer has a different function. And this is what a lot of people associate with an anvil. And this is a really big hammer, and there's very few people that have work that big that needs this kind of hammer. And usually there were 2 people doing it. One guy was on one side, and one guy was on the other side. And they would take an 8, this is an 8, through a 16-pound hammer, and they would bring it down on the piece. If they were forged welding 2 very thick pieces of metal, and they would just continue to hammer until it stuck together. This is what most people use, 3 to 5 pounds. This is a beautiful hammer. This is, the handle's been redone, and this particular hammer head, while it's used, this is as perfect as you're gonna see. It's got marking on it and all that. It does have a name on the bottom, and some people like that. They like to know who made it, because some tools were better quality. You can expect to pay $40 to $50 for this hammer in this kind of shape. You can buy tons of them that look like this, and you can see what happened to that handle. Now the hammerhead really isn't that bad. It's a little lighter. This is like a 2 pound. And this is almost the same hammer as that one, but it's not cleaned up. Still has a maker's name. Doesn't appear to be split. So you could take this on the wheel and clean this all off, lightly steel wool the handle and oil it. And that, believe it or not, will look like that. A little shorter handle. This might have been longer. A lot of times when they broke them, they would just cut them off and put it back in. And it just gets shorter and shorter. But it should be a certain length, just for actually hammering. There's all kinds of little specialty tools, and they have funny little ends, and some are round, some are square. Some of these are actually body tools from the 1940s and 50s. But a lot of blacksmiths and tinsmiths will have these because they have very nice faces on them. This particular one, you can see the handle's all beat up. This should be replaced. But this is the important part right there. If you can clean that up and the face isn't too bad on it, then this is a nice tool. It's around $15 in the condition it's in. This is, again, a pretty typical blacksmith tool. About 4 pound, 3.5, 4 pounds, square on the front, and this is for cutting. Now, there's 2 ways to do that. You would take a chisel on the square end if you were on your anvil or if you had a hot piece of metal, and you would hit the tool until it split. They didn't have the tools that they have now with band saws and all kinds of fancy cutting tools. So this is the tool you used to separate the pieces. Again, if you look, the end of that is tapered in, and that again is for making a mark or cutting. If you wanted to put a detail on a fence or on a hinge, this is one of the tools that you could use. And these are all repairable, even though they're dirty. That's pretty typical. This is pretty typical the way you find them. You can get them in yard sales, flea markets, all kinds of places. This is a pretty typical blacksmith tool. And this is pretty beat up. Sometimes you find them, they've been well cared for. Use doesn't bother me as long as they're in decent shape, but this has been outside for 40 years. It's all pitted. And it doesn't mean it can't be used. In the beginning, I think you can buy stuff like this. It's not expensive. And you got to have a whole bunch of them. So I'm getting people to bring them in. It's just to hold rod or tube while you're working on it. Sort of the same thing, smaller size. And they made specialty. Most blacksmiths, very similar to wheelwrights and any of the trades of the 1900s, made their own tool. This tool is handmade. This is not a factory-made tool. And they made them just for the job. Whatever they were working on, they made the tool. And they did that first. So sometimes you'll run into stuff, you'll look at it, and it's kind of difficult to understand exactly what it was for. This is a tray, and even though it's not really a forge, this could be used as a forge. It's obviously turn of the century. If you look at the legs, you'll see the curved leg and the detail. Later stuff, like some of these forges, they were just functional. There was nothing particularly beautiful about them. So at some point they started going more for function than just a design. But in the turn of the century, things had legs on them, and they were basically used as part of the design, the overall design. So even though that's not a real forge, you could make it one. And sometimes you can find these things very inexpensively. These two pieces down here are railroad. This one's huge. I don't know where that one came from. This has been outside for a long time. But in the beginning of learning this blacksmithing, these will act as an anvil, and they're obtainable, 20, 50, somewhere in that range. So if you can't afford an anvil, most anvils unfortunately are $400 and up. It's very hard to find one for less than that. So this will give you something to start with, and you can bolt it down or make a table for it. And this comes back to the next item, and the next item is you have to have, this is a machinist vise, and usually they're measured by the distance here and the distance it'll open. So this might be considered a 4-inch. And typically, again, if you were bending something, making something, this is what you would use. They did make a blacksmith's version. I had one here last week, but somebody bought it. And it had a leg that goes to the floor, and you basically bolt it to the floor. And I'll have one of those in about a week, and they'll be set up in the blacksmith shop. So this is pretty much what you'd find. There's a maker number on it. I don't really know what brand it is, but this is one of the tools you have to have. And again, they're 50. They start around 50 and go up to several hundred depending on the sizes. And there are brand names that are collectible. Parker is one of the famous vise manufacturers, and they made them for shipyards, for all the really big shops where there are 100 men or more, and they did trains and stuff like that. So you have to look. The important thing to look for is the jaw, is to make sure that the face and the jaw are not too badly beat up. That other one down there has a chip, but this one's actually pretty decent. You'll see a lot of hammer marks and all kinds of dents and stuff in them, and it doesn't really matter. You just have to clean it up. These are all filthy when they come in. They've been sitting somewhere for 50 years sometimes, and that's actually better than being used because they're just dirty. So you can take this and with a little, a couple hours, 4 hours, this will look almost brand new, and put a light machine oil on it just to keep it from rusting. Now this is a pretty typical metal chisel, and you'll find these in all kinds of sizes and shapes, and it's something you're going to need a bunch of for doing different kind of detail and cutting like we talked before, where you would take it and hammer something until it broke apart or put a detail in it. And there are all kinds of qualities. These are usually pretty cheap, $5–10. And you just have to make sure that the ends aren't too badly beat up. These are, at some point when you start doing a little more detailed work, these are different layout tools, calipers. Some are for measuring diameter, inside, outside. And when you start doing work that has to be consistent, these are the tools that you need to do it, along with some sort of drawing. In the first couple of episodes we did, we talked about drawing, so that you actually sit down and draw what you're going to make, and make a pattern or a drawing. Typically in the old days it was called a blueprint, and you could pretty much follow exactly what had to be done in order, drill sizes, the whole thing. All the information was really there. So this is what you have to recreate to get that consistency. It's easy just to beat on a piece of metal. If you just want to beat on something and make, you know, knives out of files, or, you know, something that's sort of random, that's one thing. But at some point it takes quite a bit of skill. And none of these tools, other than these measuring tools, have any numbers on them. It's all done by hand and eye. And that's what blacksmiths typically learned over a long period of time. This is a welding tool, and we think this was done by a prisoner because of the detail. This would take, I'm not even sure how they did it, but you can see they turned the metal over and over and over to get this. This would be considered folk art, and folk art is probably the most desirable to collectors. It is no name, we don't know who made it, but nobody would spend the amount of time. This was a solid bar of steel, the handle, and somebody took the time to go and turn every one of those into each other to make what really is a decorative piece. So this is something you don't see very often. And again, I think this was made in somebody in prison. So. There are also, I'm going to show the last couple of items are going to be, some of these were used for jewelry, for marking. In the silver industry, which was huge in the 18 and 1900s, they did what's called chasing. And you would have a small tool that was maybe 3 or 4 inches long, and you would do a detail very similar to what's on my bracelet. And you would make a mark. Sometimes it was a person's name, initials, flowers, designs. And this is the tool you would use. It wasn't very big or very heavy, and it had a little metal tool. And I'll show you some. I'll bring some chasing tools in. But this is how they did it. It was a very small hammer. And the original ones of these came from England. Almost all the original tools that we copied later here in America were from Germany or England, because that's where all the best tools were made in the 14, 15, 1600s. So that's sort of a little introduction into the blacksmithing. I want to show one more anvil over here. This anvil is a Peter Wright, and Peter Wright was one of the famous manufacturers of the English style anvil. Much larger, much more pronounced, bigger work surfaces, and elongated horns. And these are collectible. These are the ones that get up in the $800 to $2,000, depending on condition. This one is used, and I would say this would sell for around $600, maybe $700, because it's got, you can see, this is exactly what I was talking about before. This has been used, and the edges are bent or chipped, and that diminishes the value. Now, you can have these resurfaced if you want to spend the money. There are people that would resurface this and make it clean, a clean edge to bend to. Again, it depends on the kind of work. I typically think most of the people that are going to come to the co-op are going to be people that want to work and are more concerned about getting something and starting than they are with buying something that's pristine and the edges are perfect and the color's there and all that kind of stuff. I think most people really want to have something to work with. So this is a little beat up through this section. Can be fixed, but to me it is what it is. This is a wagon wheel, and I would say this is from the 1800s, so I'm going to guess because it's hard to say. The hubs are cast, and that tells me something. They are riveted, which again is a certain era they did things in. And I'll spin it around slowly and you can see the other side. But this was the typical wheel that a blacksmith would make. The cartwright or woodwright would make this part, and then they would lay out a trough with coal or wood, and this would have to be absolutely orange to bend. This would be so hard to do, and if you look at it, you can see how consistent the edge actually is. And this was the only form they used. They took it out as a rigid piece and bent it right around the form, smoking like crazy, but it actually worked. And this is something that the only place you'd ever see this again would be in someone that did reproduction of wagons. There are a lot of people at Williamsburg and stuff, areas like that, where they have shops set up to do that. But this is an unusual piece. The wood is dry rotted, so it's really only decorative at this point. But the metalwork, to me, is what is amazing, to be able to do that in that era and have it be so consistent. We're going to open up a shop here in East Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and it's going to be called the Blacksmith's Co-op. And my principle is we are people that work with tools. And we love tools, and we love what they do, and they're important to the process of blacksmithing or metalworking. And I want to provide tools at a reasonable price to people that need them. Some people are starting out, other people are way further into the process of blacksmithing. But there is no one central place to go. So I have a fairly large building here, and I've got people that tell me they have garages full of this stuff they're not using. And some are going to donate it. The school I have is a nonprofit school. So this is not profit orientated per se. But I want to make this stuff available so that there's some place to go if you're in this area or even not too far away, where you could come and basically get set up in several visits and at least get you started.